right. I would like to call to order the special board meeting of the SCV GSA Board of Directors. We can start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand and join me in reciting the pledge. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, this meeting is being conducted in person at the SCV Water Agency boardroom. One sec, turn this on. As a convenience to the public, members of the public may also participate virtually by logging into the agency's Zoom meeting. Any member of the public may also listen to the meeting or make comments to the board using the call-in number or Zoom webinar link. In the event there is a disruption of service which prevents the agency from broadcasting the meeting to members of the public using either the call-in option or the internet-based option, the meeting will not be postponed or rescheduled, but will continue without remote participation. The remote participation option is provided as a convenience to the public and is not required. Members of the public are welcome to attend the meeting in person. To participate in public comment from your computer, tablet, or smartphone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, click the raised hand feature in Zoom. You will be notified when it's your turn to speak, and please unmute when requested. To participate in public comment via phone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, dial *9 to raise your hand. When it is your turn to speak, dial *6 to unmute. Do we have any public present, April?
We do.
Okay. Attending, public that is attending in person, there are public comment cards on the table outside. Please complete those and return them to the board secretary to help expedite public comments. The procedures for today's meeting are as follows. I will introduce each agenda item. Staff will present. I will ask for public comment. I will then ask for discussion and questions from board members. Once concluded, I will ask for a motion and a second. After any further discussion, the board secretary will call for roll call votes. We have all board members present. We have a substitute, don't we, April?
We do. Director Ozahoski is missing tonight and Jeff Ford is the alternate for him.
Terrific. Okay, thank you. All right, we can start with public comment, item 1.3. Do we have any public comment on non-agenda items, either virtually or in person?
We do not.
All right. Item 1.4 is approval of the agenda. Do we have any changes or additions? Seeing none, we will approve the agenda as written and move on to the consent calendar. Any public comment on the consent calendar?
We do not.
Any board discussion on the consent calendar?
Madam President, I have a comment on the minutes.
Okay.
I see that Vice President Bryden is not listed at all in the attendance for the meeting on October 3rd. Even those of us who were not in attendance that day are listed as absent, but he doesn't exist in October 3rd. Yeah, so
Okay.
if we could add now soon to be President Bryden to that list and put him as absent.
My alternate attendant.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
so.
That may be just how Ms. Kang does your minutes when somebody's an alternate, but I will ask her. I will have her add them.
Director Bryden is not an alternate.
Oh, that's right. It's not. Yeah, I'll
Right.
have her add that. We'll have
No,
to make that
that
correction.
he had the alternate was here. So is the alternate listed?
Yes.
Yeah. Directors.
I think that's maybe
Yeah.
just how she does
This
it
is for
because
2.1.
Mhm.
He's listed, it says Sammy Kabar alternate for Russ Bryden. Director
Yeah.
absent Russ Bryden.
I think she probably just lists it that way. When somebody's missing, then the alternate gets the position. They're just not listed.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments on the consent calendar?
President Guzman.
Yes.
I just would like to have the spelling of my name corrected and all the polling on the votes left out the R each and every time.
Okay, any other changes? Do we have a motion with that? We'll incorporate that change in the final version. Is there a motion to?
I'll make the motion.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, who is that motion?
Gibbs.
Thank you.
All right, all those in favor?
I,
Aye.
Great. All right, the next item is 3.1. Oh, you need did you do roll call or you need a roll call at this point?
We should do a roll call.
It says roll call, yeah.
Okay. As I call
We-
your name, please state how you vote. Yeah, we normally, do you normally do that at this meeting? You guys do roll calls?
I don't think so unless we have call in. Is it required? Is it required legal counsel?
No, it's not required, but you do have to announce the number of votes for and against
Okay,
after the vote.
oh. Might as well do roll call.
Okay, as I call your name, please state how you vote. Director Cooper,
Yes.
Director Gibbs,
Aye.
Director Martin,
Yes.
Director Natoli,
abstain, I was absent.
Director Ford,
I will also abstain.
Vice President Bryden,
Abstain.
President Gutzeit.
Yes,
I believe that is enough, right? General Counsel? Mhm. It's not enough. Is enough
it is not.
for it. Okay, so the consent calendar is approved, correct? Yeah,
Right.
Okay.
All right, thank you. The next item is 3.1, Bouquet Creek status update presentation by Mr. Steve Cole.
Thank you, President Gutzeit. Yes, I have a brief update about Bouquet Canyon. I think a couple of the members of this board were able to attend. I think both Director Martin and President Gutzeit were there. You were still out vacation. We did have a community meeting up at the church up off of Copper Hill. The county public works staff and fifth district supervisor staff were there kind of really leading that meeting. It was well attended. There were several small pumpers from the canyon. Some of the cabin owners, for those of you that aren't too aware, most of you probably are by now, but there are some leased properties that are up quite a ways up the canyon, the Bouquet Canyon, that they have some properties, cabins along that stretch that some people live in. So they were represented pretty well also. Pretty good meeting, I think, all in all. Like I said, public works staff did a really good job of, I think, leading kind of where the status of the project is currently. It's a unique role that California Department of Fish and Wildlife are playing. They are truly in a partnership role at this stage in the project. I think it's something really interesting to take away. You usually don't see a kind of the regulatory community working in that role. They truly are in this. They were well represented. Ed Pert, their manager for basically Southern California, was present and helping explain kind of the objectives for the restoration side of the project. The public works staff did a really good job of explaining kind of the challenges of the roadway and the flooding and the infrastructure that's needed to address those things. Fielded a lot of questions from the community members. I think some of the community members obviously are pretty intense on the impacts that they've had over the last several years. I mean, a lot of them have access to water, and it's a well that has gone dry because those releases are no longer supplying the historical amounts that had been. So all in all, I thought it was a really good meeting. The objective of the meeting was to present the project, hear from the community, be able to incorporate that feedback into a grant application that's being applied for. And that's really where California Department of Fish and Wildlife is partnering in. There's a Wildlife Conservation Board grant that will be applied for the beginning of this year by the county. And so I would encourage anybody that's supportive of that project to get a support letter into the county of Los Angeles. And well represented. I think there was members of the environmental community, like I said, the owners along the way. Water agency was there, LA Department of Water and Power was there. So a really good chance to get back out in the community and kind of explain the challenges of that project. I think, the one frustrating takeaway is these things do not happen quickly when you're talking about trying to do the full scale project. And so the design element, is a significant effort that is going to be undertaken, assuming the grant comes through, and then ultimately trying to get to construction. But, it's several years out from completion. And I think the community was frustrated about that. They really wanted to see more of a quick start type project, but the scale of it is just really difficult to do that in that canyon. So with that, I'll conclude my comments and be happy to answer any questions.
Any public comment on this, April?
There is not.
Okay. Director Gibbs?
Yeah, thank you. Steve, I had one question. When we talk about the scope of the project and the scale, do we know what that scope and scale is at this point and everything that would be associated with it?
I think we're starting to get a pretty good idea of what it looks like. The public works staff kind of walked through what that is. It's basically, major road improvement. So elevating the road in certain sections. It's installation of debris control structures and culverts and realignment of the creek in certain areas to address flooding. And then the other component is a major restoration component. So looking at the kind of environmental values of the creek and the watershed there and trying to improve those. There's several elements of the project that will involve that as well.
Do we know what they're looking for in terms of funding from the grant?
So the current grant application is for the engineering side of the project. I believe it's in the $7 to $9 million range for the engineering aspect of the project currently.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Just a quick question, Steve. Army Corps at the table.
Army Corps has not been at the table yet, but they will need to be. As you're well aware of, Director Ford, they will need to be a party to this. I think it's probably just not quite ripe enough yet to get their input on permits and things, but they're going to need to be part of it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a couple. Did our staff hear from Roger Herring in the past? Because he emailed me. He was one, I believe he lives up there as well, or towards that direction. He emailed me about a presentation on his information. And I was wondering if the SCV Water or anyone has heard that yet.
I have not. I did talk to Roger that night,
Mhm.
and gave him my contact information if he wanted to reach out.
Do you think it's something that the staff, I feel it would be better that staff hear it rather than me. Would that be okay?
We'd be happy to hear what
Okay.
Roger has on his mind.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And then the other thing, I just wanted to comment, being at that meeting, I had a couple takeaways or observations. Certainly the residents, like you said, were interested in access. They were very interested in, the speeding up there on that road. One person even said, it would be better if you just leave it a dirt road so people slow down. There Also, I heard a lot of interest in recreation and restoring the recreational components up there, especially from the people that have lived there a long time or knew the area. And so, and what I heard from Fish and Wildlife was extreme interest in restoring the habitat, and there was some debate of whether it's current habitat or could be future habitat, and I understand both are important. But so my question is this: if Fish and Wildlife is leading now, are the residents that are interested in recreation or, road design, are they still going to be able to chime in and be heard as the project goes? Like, are they going to be able to have a input on the actual project design, or is it strictly we're doing the habitat, you other people can worry about that other stuff later? What do you think?
My suggestion would be that anybody that's interested in the project, kind of the scope of it, that they reach out to the county public works. So they are the lead on the project. California Department of Fish and Wildlife is playing a key partnership in the project, but I would say that the overall project proponent is going to be the County of Los Angeles. So if they have comments or questions, that's where they should go.
Yeah, and Supervisor Barger's staff person, Natalie, right? Was Natalie?
Yes.
Was there. And they also gave out a website if anybody's interested in following it. There is a Public Works website. I found it. You can sign up, and they advise that people sign up if you're interested in, on following the project and getting updates. Because Fish and Wildlife just really was really the lead on, they most vocal on this meeting, but I know other people had other concerns. So we want to know how they can be involved. All right, if nobody has any other comments, we can move on to the next one. Much awaited presentation on salt and nutrient management plan. I know we postponed this last month because of some people were out. So that is also Steve Cole.
And hopefully Ernesto's joining us virtually.
Yes, he will be, Steve. And I was just going to say a couple introductory remarks, but Ernesto's here.
Why don't you go ahead, Rick?
Okay.
Yep.
So, Ernesto is joining us remotely today. He's got a little bit of a cold, so we thought he'd join us remotely. This is an item that, as you said, President Gutzeit, has been talked about before, and just a little bit context, because it's been some time. The groundwater sustainability plan uses the salt and nutrient management plan as a metric for basin sustainability. That approach was taken because the GSP during development, we didn't see a need to develop yet another system. And so in March, your board adopted the annual report for the GSA, but the salt and nutrient management plan hadn't been updated yet. That update came shortly after. In June, we briefed your board. The salt and nutrient management plan has come in. We've reviewed it. We find things are being managed sustainably, and we had some more discussion though about what that salt and nutrient management plan was. And so Ernesto has led up the most recent update, and he's joining us remotely to walk through a little bit of a higher level discussion about the salt and nutrient management plan, not specifically focused on the GSA, but just in general. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ernesto.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Rick, for the introduction. Let me share my screen here and we'll get started on this presentation. All right. Can everyone see the presentation view?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. So as Rick said, this is going to be a high level presentation on what the salt nutrient management plan is, how we locally manage our basin, and at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. So we'll start off with some background information, regulations, the purpose of the salt nutrient management plan, the methodology that was used. And then, as Rick said, he did update you on the findings and conclusions of the 2022 salt nutrient management plan update. But I'll review that because it has been some time, and let me know if you need any clarification on anything. So getting started, in 2009, there was the recycled water policy that was put forth by the state, and this mandated the increase in use of recycled water at the time, and also provided some goals for the production and use of recycled water, as well as setting forth the requirement for each basin to produce a salt nutrient management plan. And the goal of this was really to streamline permitting of recycled water projects, all within the framework of a salt nutrient management plan. Now, that framework that was provided, it was really going to be, it's really just a framework for each agency to use in development, because every single salt nutrient management plan is going to be tailor-made to the basin in which it's managing. So our salt nutrient management plan will have to manage the same constituents, but maybe in a different way. So everyone will kind of have their own custom-made salt nutrient management plan that pertains to the challenges and constituents that are in a particular area. So the purpose of this salt nutrient management plan is, as I mentioned, a framework for those management practices. And I'll review those management practices in the upcoming slides, give you a better definition. But it's really to, the plan really is focused on basin-wide water quality modeling, data collection, and modeling as well. And all of this is completed on a basin-wide basis to protect the beneficial uses and allow for long-term sustainability of our groundwater resources, so that we can manage our basin responsibly on the long-term basin, protect those beneficial uses. So how does it work locally?
Ernesto,
Yes.
sorry, can I ask you a comment on the intro? Just to go to a super high level, can you please tell us the reason that salt and nutrient management is tied to recycled water? In general, it would be, I assume, because recycled water somehow could increase those if it's not done correctly, but can you say why they're tied together?
Correct. So in using recycled water, there are nutrients within that water supply, like nitrogen. That water supply tends to have higher TDS. It's treated, so it's going to have a chlorine. So there's nutrient loading within that recycled water that, if not managed properly, could have impacts on the streams in which it's discharged in. So there's a variety of management practices and projects that can be implemented to help mitigate or minimize those impacts. And those are outlined and detailed in the salt nutrient management plan, so that we can manage our basin appropriately while using that recycled water.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for the question. So that framework allows us to practice those, to implement those projects and management practices in a way that complies with our basin management objectives, and also provides flexibility for allowing adjustments to those management practices to adapt to changing conditions. Now, as you can see here, we have our management practices, and to help define what those management practices are, as some of you may remember, some of those historic measures and practices that we have taken place are the restrictions on brine discharges from water softeners into sewage systems to help minimize that the salt loading that was going to the rivers. Another one would be the prohibition of the installation of those salt water systems, rebate programs, chlorine discharge limits that were implemented. There's also TMDLs for nitrogen. These are all types of management practices that are implemented. There's also projects that are evaluated in the salt nutrient management plan. So water management practices, projects, they kind of go hand in hand when they're referenced in the salt nutrient management plan. Some of those projects that were evaluated are the chloride compliance program, even our water use, SCV water use efficiency programs included in there, as well as recycle water expansion efforts are outlined and modeled in the salt nutrient management plan. And what is then done is water quality information is collected basin-wide and evaluated and modeled, all to protect those beneficial uses of municipal water, industrial water, even ag water. And all that aligns with SCV Water Strategic Plan Goal D, which is making sure that we're doing everything, that we're maintaining water quality and environmental compliance. All that comes full circle into an update and a report. Once we have those management practices, we collect the information, we model the information, and provide periodic updates and reports. And if needed, making adjustment to those management practices if it's determined that we need to make an adjustment. So the update report that was provided in 2022 was a small report that just took into account the recent, the last from 2011 through 2019 water quality data. A larger update will need to be done to the salt nutrient management plan in 2026, reviewing the plan as a whole. But a small update, which Rick previously went over, was completed in order to bring that water quality information up to date.
Madam President, I have a question for Ernesto.
Mhm.
Ernesto, this is Director Natoli. With respect to the water softeners,
Mhm.
how are we regulating the prohibition on installation and the discharge of the brine? How are we enforcing those?
That was previously completed. Rick, please remind me, I believe is measure S, right?
Yes, I believe it was Measure S, and this is going back quite a few years, but as I think you alluded to, Director Nicoli, they've been banned here in Santa Clarita. So there was no grandfathering of existing systems. People are still allowed to have the Culligan man type here, but the self-regenerating ones that reduce the brine are no longer allowed here.
And enforcement is just, I take it on faith.
Well, I think, we would probably want to hear from the sanitation district on that. It's not something that SCV Water would enforce, but so I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Ernesto.
Thank you.
I think,
Thank you, Rick.
yeah, maybe we can get some follow-up information just back on that, because I also seem to recall that maybe we can't buy salt in Santa Clarita anymore. I don't know. There was some debate about that. But can we just next time get an update on how the salt restrictions are enforced? I also know that there's a saltwater pool prohibition. So I'm looking at Mayor Gibbs. I don't know how that would get caught either, because contractors want to sell you what they want to sell you. But yeah, just next time, paragraph on what's going on.
You got it.
Director Cooper.
I converted mine to saltwater pool, and you sign a statement that says you will not discharge into the sewer or into the storm drain, and it has to be a truck that comes out and discharge your pool into a truck and be hauled off somewhere else, wherever they take it. But yeah, yes.
Interesting. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so moving on, just I know Rick had covered this in the previous meeting, but just wanted to briefly cover the 2022 update. The approach was data collection, QA/QC, basin-wide through various sources, And I'll show you some of the management zones in the upcoming slide. But additionally, there's data interpretation and development of groundwater conditions, and then updating the salt nutrient management plan model. And in beginning that update to the salt nutrient management plan model, there was an update first and foremost to the balances in each management zone, and that is shown here on the top right and the top right and bottom right of the screen, with the top right being the alluvial storage volumes in acre feet for each management zone. And again, I'll show you a map of the management zone so you can get a better idea of how it's laid out within our basin. And the bottom right is the Saugus Aquifer, and the water balance for each area was calculated so that the salt and nutrient balance for each zone could be interpolated based off that information. So putting that information together, we're able to calculate the ambient water quality and use that information as well as the changing conditions to project water quality out through 2035. So those management zones outlined here, the light blue is the Saugus Aquifer, which underlies the whole basin. And then the colorful ones, management zones 1 through 5, are the alluvial management zones broken up. And you can see those green here. We have Mid Canyon, Placerita Canyon, the South Fork Management Zone 3, and the Santa Clara from Boca Canyon to San Francisco, as well as the Castaic Valley. So those 6 management zones were established, samples were collected throughout the basin to determine that ambient water quality, and that information was used to make projections. Now, I do want to point out that the cross-hatched area in the middle there is designated as management zone 1B. And the reason that's important is we do have water quality objectives for each management zone. However, in zone 1B, there's exceedances in the water quality objectives, and that's in the development of the salt nutrient management plan and in talks with the LA regional board. It was determined that the natural geologic formation within that area was likely responsible for the elevated concentration of TDS and sulfate within that area. So it was designated its own subzone, differentiating it from all of zone 1, since it not necessarily something that was man-made, but geologic in nature. So it wouldn't affect the averages of the entire zone. Now, here's just an overview of monitoring locations within those zones, and you can see it's pretty widespread throughout the area. And then we have a annual precipitation overview. Now, during the study period, the majority of the study period was during a dry time. Now, this does go back to 1930, but I'd like to point you over to the right side of the table. And you can see that the cumulative departure curve, meaning from one point to the other, if the slope is going downwards, it's a below average year. And if the slope from one point to the next is going upwards, it's an above average year. And you can see from 2010 through the end of the study period, the slope is for the most part going downwards, meaning we had below average rainfall throughout almost the entire study period. And the reason that's important is one of the conclusions in the 2022 update was that the concentration of the constituents was still mostly within the water quality objectives, but were slightly elevated compared to the 2016 update because drought conditions tend to concentrate constituents within a basin, so there's not new water coming in. So I just that's the reason this table is in here, just so you can see that those dry conditions can really concentrate constituents in the basin. So we have just an overview, a table of the results of the 2022 plan. It goes from management zone 1 through 6. Now notice there are management zones 2 and 3 that are missing. There was some data collected within those zones, but not enough to produce reliable results, interpolated results. There were a couple there were a couple wells and monitoring points that were added since, and we're looking to add more to fill those data gaps. But we will make sure that that gets updated for our next report update. In the meantime, we're looking to expand the monitoring network in those particular zones. So what's shown here is the zones that did have sufficient data to come up with the projections and ambient water quality calculations. So there are some areas in red for ambient water quality, and you can see zone 1B does have some exceedances in the ambient water quality compared to water quality objectives. And these are the exact same, everything in red are the exact same areas that were also identified in the 2016 salt nutrient management plan. So there's nothing new or out of the ordinary here. So we do have on the, if we take this line by line, you look at zone 1A, we have the objectives on the first line, ambient water quality on the second line, and then projected concentrations. And as you can see, for the majority of these areas, when implementing when calculating the projected average concentration, the way those are projected is we include those management practices and those upcoming projects that are under development, like the water reclamation plants and expansion to recycle water. And when taking those projects into account, when we're projecting, you can see that those projects have a net benefit in reducing the concentrations of nutrients, or at least completely mitigating or at least minimizing the impacts by implementing projects and utilizing that recycled water, and as well as those management practices. So overall, you can define that as a net benefit to the basin when implementing those projects. So the findings.
Ernesto.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I had a question that there was one on there that actually still, it went up, and that was chloride in zone 4. Can you explain that?
Yes, so the water quality objective is 700, or let's see where we are at chloride. So it is 102, and in speaking with the modelers, the science here is not exacting, so it is very close to the objective, meaning that it could just be noise in the modeling in the estimates that are produced. So it's not something that's necessarily worrisome, but it is something that we'll be keeping an eye on and can continue conversations with the regional board to see if we need to make any adjustments. But at the time, in looking at this, it's not something that is considered problematic at the time, but something that we do need to keep in mind and keep an eye on to make sure that it's not going to be an issue in the future.
I think what I was asking was, it looks like it is projected to get worse from the ambient, from 93 going up to 103. Is that modeling noise, or is that something going on in that area, or do we not know?
I don't know. I don't know at this time, but we are looking at doing additional investigations within this area and keeping an eye on this spot specifically because of that reason. So when I get an answer for you, I'm more than happy to share that.
Okay, and we have a couple other questions I see on this slide. Director Cooper.
Left it on. Ernesto, Castaic Valley, why is the water quality objective at 1,000 parts per million when everybody else is right down around 700? Why is it so much higher?
I'm not sure the reason why it's higher. The numbers are based off of the basin plan objectives that are set by the regional board, but I'm not entirely sure why it was determined to be at that level compared to the other areas. I think I heard someone else talking.
I'm sorry, so the regional board sets that, is that right?
From the basin plan, LA Regional Water Quality Control Board has their basin plan, and these numbers are straight from the basin plan. So not determined by us.
Okay, thank you.
Director Natoli?
Thank you, President Goodside. Ernesto, how was it determined that the nutrient concentrations in management subzone 1B were naturally occurring? And how was that how was the boundary for subzone 1B determined?
So I wasn't there during the creation of the salt nutrient management plan in 2016. So I'm taking this information based off of notes and the actual plan. And in the actual plan, it just states that there were discussions with the regional board and that this particular area seemed to have some natural geologic formation that was causing elevated levels of TDS and sulfates. As for the boundary, I'm not sure how exactly they determined that boundary, but I believe it's based off of the water quality information that was collected through the various monitoring zones, and in that specific area having elevated TDS and sulfate for those monitoring locations. My guess is that's how they drew the boundaries there, but I apologize. It's really just through I wasn't there during the creation, so it's really secondhand information from the plan itself and what was documented.
It just seems very interesting to me that subzone 1B is so geologically different from other areas when 1B is really a very small area. That's what I would almost call a suspect terrain. Anybody who can go back to the 1980s and you're familiar with some plate tectonic theories, but I find it very curious that it's that different. But thank you, Ernesto.
Of course, thank you.
I mean, can we maybe pull that section out of the plan just to answer? If it's still publicly available, maybe there's more in the text.
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. See if there's additional information there.
Thank you. Any other questions on this slide before we move on? Oh, okay, seeing none. Carry on.
Thank you for the questions. So just to reiterate those findings, implementation of the projects/management practices will provide a net benefit to the basin by providing additional water supply and conservation activities while mitigating, or in some cases, just minimizing the water quality impacts within those management zone areas. So the 2016 conclusion remains valid when viewing it through the scope of the 2022 report update, and increases of constituent concentrations in their respective zones are likely due to below average rainfall during the majority of the study period. And modeling indicated that projected concentrations will be lower than the water quality objectives in most areas, with the exception of minor exceedances in some areas, which we will be keeping an eye on to see if we need to change any tactics or practices. And closing comments, we did add 2 new wells to management zone 3, and we were working with LA County Flood Control District to see if there's existing wells within some of those zones to see if we can expand our monitoring network. Some were identified, but ended up being dry for the last couple of years. So we're back to the drawing board there, and we will be expanding our monitoring network within management zones 2 and 3 so that we can do those calculations for ambient water quality and work on those projections. The other thing we're looking at is evaluating transition of salt nutrient management plan database and hopefully being able to pair that up with the GSP database so that everything is housed in one location, and being able to just take a subset of the GSP database for salt nutrient management plan purposes. So we'll be evaluating that and seeing if that's feasible. And then the last thing is we want to begin engaging stakeholders in preparation for that large 10-year salt nutrient management plan update for 2026. So we'll be beginning that process hopefully this year, and making sure that we're prepared for that large update. It's going to be a large lift and a lot of information, a lot of stakeholders, and want to get going on that early as we can. So with that, that's all I have for you today. Happy to answer any other questions, and thank you for the questions during the presentation. Anything else? Any other questions that I'd be happy to answer?
So first I'll ask for any public comment.
There is none.
Okay, we have no public comment. Any director comments or questions? Director Ford.
Thank you. Ernesto, the modeling period is, I think you said 2020 through 2035. Can you explain the hydrology assumptions for the model?
Sure. Let me see here. We have inputs. We have inflow term, inflow. So it's based off of that hydrology, that 1930 through current hydrology period, and I believe they used 1997 through current hydrology period, just because there was a couple periods of drought and a couple periods of increased rainfall during that period. But some of the inflow and outflow terms that were included in the modeling process for inflow terms, where they're taking a look at that precipitation, deep precipitation, percolation from precipitation, deep percolation from septic systems. They're taking into account applied water from recharge, stream bed leakage from one zone to another. For outflow terms, there's evaporation that's taken into account. There's a lot going into. I think that may be a little more detail. I apologize to Director Ford, but does that help answer some of your question?
It does. I was just more interested in the years, what the model years were that they chose for this go around. Because like, as you mentioned, we had a long dry spell. And so when you talk about possibly some of the constituents going up in concentration, I was just wondering if they were just using the last 15-year period or something like that. But it sounds like they started a little earlier than that for the modeling. 97, you said, was the start year? I
believe is 97. I can double check the exact time period, but we did want to cover some areas of some periods of wet hydrology, as well as the dry hydrology that happened during the last 10 years.
Okay. And another question is, in this update, we haven't, from the 2016 plan, did we alter any of the expected measures in the plan that would affect salt and nutrients? Or is this just a reevaluation of the expected concentrations given those same measures that were in the 2016 plan?
It's regarding the same measures that were in the 2016 plan with an adjustment to the timing of certain projects to account for that. So I believe at the time there were certain projects that were expected to be completed in 2018, which were delayed. So the timing on some of those management practices, those projects were adjusted in the 2022 plan.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Seeing none on that side. Anybody over here with questions? Okay, I have Director Gibbs, did you have no? Oh, okay. One slide back, you mentioned a couple places with a minor exceedances of water quality objectives. Does anything happen to us? Like, is that fines and penalties? Is it that projects can't go forward? What happens if we don't hit all of the water quality objectives?
So the regional board was looking at this through a basin-wide compliance, a net benefit. So there are some minor exceedances in the projected values. So what's done is the report's sent to the regional board. We have discussions with them on what adjustments we can make to any management practices, so that we make sure that we're meeting those objectives when in the future. But all the projects that are included within the salt nutrient management plan are already approved and being built. So for future projects, if we would like to implement something else, we want to make sure that we're hitting those water quality objectives, so that there's no hiccups for undefined future projects. But as of now, everything that's included within the salt nutrient management plan is covered, and adjustments will be made as necessary in discussion with their regional board through periodic updates.
Okay, so it sounds like they're not going to, send anybody a nasty letter with a $10,000 per day penalty if we miss a localized water quality objective.
Yeah, I mean, in that diagram that I showed earlier, it shows that, we have our management practices, we're going to collect the data, and we're going to report to the regional board. And there's some flexibility there with making adjustments as needed to adapt to those changing conditions and adjustments and regulations. So it's a loop that's feeding itself, and it allows for flexibility and
Okay.
Allowing us to proceed.
Okay, and again, the projects that are in this loop are recycled water projects only, right? Are we looking at any other projects like recharge project? Well, that might be recycled, but like stormwater capture, would that go through this loop, or is it only recycled water projects?
It could go through this loop, stormwater capture. There are some in the 2026 update, we will be including a wider scope of projects than was outlined in the 2016 salt nutrient management report. Just as we've gathered more information and we've thought of more ways we can collaborate with different stakeholders within the community. So we do plan on adding additional projects to that scope, but currently in the 2016 version, it's just those recycle water projects that were outlined. For example, the chloride compliance program, the efficiency program, the recycle water expansion efforts, and the water reclamation plants, both Vista Canyon and Deep Hall, which were implemented in the 2016 report.
Okay. And this report, the original and the update are available on the SCV water website, correct?
I believe so. I know this 2016 version is available. The 2022 version, I believe, is available, but I will double check, and if not, I'll make sure I'll work with our department, make sure it gets included there.
Okay, why don't we just follow up on all these questions from the directors that couldn't get answered today, and maybe an email or something with like links or answers, like Director Ford's, confirming the years, Director Natoli's question about the geology. I think just a email answer to the ones that we couldn't answer today would be great.
Absolutely.
That was a great presentation. Thank you. Director Martin has a question.
Sorry for coming in late, President Gutzeit, but I did on one of the earlier slides, perhaps first one or two slides or so, there was a statement about the goal, setting a goal for streamlining the permitting of recycled water projects. What does that actually mean? How does that translate to what actually went into the report?
So rather than having to go through a whole CEQA process for every individual recycled water project that we would like to go implement, the salt nutrient management plan provides that framework where we can take a project or a variety of projects, put them into the salt nutrient management plan, collect the water quality information, conduct the modeling, and see how those projects will affect either have a detrimental or net benefit in nutrient loading to the basin. So rather than having to go through this process many different times, it helps kind of lump everything together and evaluate the basin as a whole and all the projects as a whole to make sure that these things can get permitted and across the threshold so that we can move forward with the projects.
So for a permit for recycled water, we just refer to the SNMP for as a reference, and that checks that box. Is that the idea?
That's for
Simple minded.
yeah. That I guess you can say that's the idea.
Okay. All right.
And
Thank
I'll
you.
just add, that's one of the boxes you check.
Yeah.
Along with a litany of others, but yeah, it's supposed to help streamline the process of checking that box. Yeah, and I think it does. I think, and Director Ford will remember this because he was around when the first generation plan was conducted. We learned a lot from that plan, and I think this next round, you'll see a much more, informed plan of just because we know more now, and I think it will help us in checking that box and achieving that goal of streamlined permitting. So that is the hope.
Good. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ernesto.
Thank
We
you.
have one more from Director Natoli.
Thank you, President Gutzeit. Just as a follow-up from Director Martin, so the salt and nutrient management plan is a CEQA equivalent? Because I thought only CEQA equivalencies could be referred to where you didn't have to do CEQA, like a local coastal program. If you have a certified local coastal program, it doesn't need CEQA. Individual projects in the area covered by the LCP need CEQA, but you don't need to do CEQA for the LCP because it's considered a CEQA equivalent. In other words, the work you're doing to create your LCP is equivalent to what you do for a CEQA review. So if the SNMP allows you to check the box, that's my question. Then the SNMP is a CEQA equivalent program or not?
I don't think so. No, I think it allows you to check the box that you've evaluated this component of CEQA, meaning the water quality impacts from a project like a recycled water project. So it wouldn't prevent you from having to go through CEQA.
Right.
It would be part of what is included in the CEQA analysis for the project.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for clarifying, Steve.
I'm still kind of concerned about the Castaic zone that says that the water quality goal is 1,000 parts TDS, where you have zone 1B that's in excess of 900, and it's said it's because of its own geology of what's in the ground, that it's over what the stated water quality goal is. It seems like that one, since they know that it's, or they assume that it's something in the ground that's causing that, would be up at the 1,000 range, because you're always going to show that you have a failure in that zone until they change that. So I don't know how that gets changed. Is that something that we do with them, or?
Yes. Basin objectives are an interesting science. They go back a long way. And so I think what you're raising is a real issue that in this next plan, I think we're going to be taking a lot closer look at that aspect of it. Meaning, are those basin objectives the right basin objectives?
Doesn't seem like.
Changing them is a very difficult process, but if the data supports, going through that process, then it's something that may be worth investigating.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ernesto. That was a great presentation.
Happy to do it. Thank you all for your great questions.
Thanks. All right, we will move on to item 3.3, quarterly status update of the groundwater sustainability plan implementation presented by Rick Vergoots.
Thank you, President Gutzeit.
Just one moment, Rick.
We're just getting the PowerPoint loaded here, it looks like. All set? Great.
Where are you?
Thank you. Okay, looks like we're up and running, so we'll walk through these slides today. This is our regular quarterly update to your board. Next slide, please, April. So there are a number of items described in the board memo in your package today. I'm going to gloss over some of these and spend a little bit more time on some of the others. So we have a number of contracts that we're managing now. Most of them you were already aware of. There is a fourth contract now with GeoSyntech for a data management system. So we'll talk about that a little bit further down the road. Oh, what the heck? We'll just talk about it now. We have a contract with GeoSyntech to take the Microsoft Access-based data management system that was prepared for the Groundwater Sustainability Agency and convert it into a different software application that is web accessible and a little bit easier to use. So that's underway now, and that is going to be really helpful for us as we move forward to print the required annual reports and whatnot for the GSP. Okay, thank you for that. Moving on, addressing data gaps. So these first two bullet items, the domestic wells and the non-de minimis wells, these are items that are closely related because the state's records of wells are being sifted through for both of these efforts. The staff report goes into a little bit of detail with domestic wells. It talks about well records of roughly 1,200 wells that we've been going through. Roughly 370 of those records may be domestic wells. This effort, filling the data gaps on domestic wells, is described in the GSP, largely with focus to identify wells in the canyon areas that could be used for filling data gaps with water quality and water level. So the database is largely built up. We're now filtering through and we'll begin to focus more on specific wells moving forward. Also, with domestic wells, the SCV Water, on behalf of the GSA, recently submitted a grant application that would fund additional work with looking at well records in the basin. Whereas with the GSP implementation, we're mainly looking in the canyon areas. The grant application that's been submitted would look at the well records valley-wide and look more at well status and things of that nature. So a lot going on with domestic wells. The database that's been developed is a really good product. We're still refining it. Just getting that database developed was a heavy lift. In terms of the non-de minimis wells, so these are wells that extract greater than 2 acre-feet per year. There's more work coming on this next quarter. The groundwater sustainability plan describes that a metering and reporting program would be implemented for non-de minimis wells. So these are private wells, agricultural wells that would be adding in their extraction data to a database so the GSA could better understand those extractions. Pretty straightforward. We have identified roughly 25 of these wells, and we continue to work towards making sure that's the right number. And then we're going to begin outreach in those areas to talk with the well operators. We'll talk to your board too, before we get too far along with any kind of policy level discussions. On land subsidence, we've made good progress on this. Rick Vasilopoulos from Water Resources has been out with Tanya Saxon from our GIS group, beginning to locate existing County of Los Angeles benchmarks. With that, we're now looking at putting in benchmarks through use of a licensed land surveyor to fill data gaps, and also talking more with the city and the county about where we think the most subsidence prone areas are. So that's moving forward. Groundwater flow model refinement, we've got a few slides on that. Yes, Director Cooper.
Before you get going off of subsidence, if you're going to use the county's benchmarks around the valley, how old are they?
Great question.
Because, you know, when the 94 earthquake hit, the valley here dropped about 11 inches. And I know Metropolitan, because I managed the plant that's right over the hill, a Jensen plant. We had to go clear back to Bakersfield to get benchmarks because the whole San Fernando Valley had dropped. So if those benchmarks are too old or they haven't been reestablished, you may be getting some strange data from what you originally had.
I am writing that down, and I'll follow up on that. I do know that the benchmarks have been around, some of them for decades.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
Okay, I appreciate you bringing that up.
They'll show as subsidence, but it was actually earthquake results.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, on to groundwater flow model refinement. There's been a lot of effort going on here. April, next slide, please. So in June, we described to your board that there was refinement needed to the GDE triggers because they weren't matching what we expected them to match in the groundwater sustainability plan. I want to point out that we're not talking about changing the approach we talked about with GSP triggers, just making them closer to what the GSP said they should be, which is based on 2 feet above the historic low water levels upstream of I-5 in particular. So what are we learning? Well, we're working on refining the groundwater flow model. We've included recent LIDAR data of the river valley, which is important, of course. We want to have a good understanding of the elevation in the river valley when we're talking about groundwater dependent ecosystems. We recently, belts and suspenders or trust but verify approach, we did some transects across the Santa Clara River, also using a licensed land surveyor to see if those tracked with the recent LIDAR elevation survey. You know, LIDAR is a laser, is an aerial method that uses lasers to measure the ground surface elevation, but we wanted to get some actual ground surface elevations just as a check. What we found is there was good agreement. They were within a foot or so. So that was good. So we've done some recent transects across the river that identify that the LIDAR work is where we need it to be. We've also collected about 9 months of groundwater elevation data from the GDE wells upstream from Interstate 5. We didn't have that earlier. We have it now. We're working on geologic cross sections through the area. We have an example of that today we'll share with you, and other study as well. I know GSI, our hydrogeologic consultant, is looking at the model, evaluating lithology and water levels in other parts of the basin. Next slide, please. So the approach with the GDE triggers, I mentioned this earlier, was that they would be set 2 feet above the minimum threshold for groundwater elevations upstream from Interstate 5. We're not suggesting that change. I'll share with you a cross section. We're using geologic cross sections to really dial in our understanding using survey data to make sure we've got the right level of accuracy with these. Big picture, what we found is though we have good historic information on the minimum water levels in the basin, some of these triggers are higher than 2 feet above the minimum threshold, which is what we said we would set them at. And so I'm going to show you an example slide here that shows that. April. So this is a slide that reflects a transect across the Santa Clara River. This location is at the N wells to the north. Bridgeport Park is on the northern side of the cross section. To the south is where the N wells are. The baseball fields are just west, and the Mercedes dealer is just east. So this is this is our upstream GDE monitoring area. The land surface that you see on top is based on the licensed land surveyor transect. And we'll share more of these cross sections when they're completed. But this is an improvement over the older digital elevation model that we had in the basin, obviously. Beneath the land surface, you'll see a dashed blue line that goes from left to right. That dashed blue line represents the July groundwater elevations in the basin. And that goes from, on the left side of the slide, 3 of the N wells. It goes under the river where we now have a well called GDEA. That is a new well. And then we're also picking up that groundwater elevation at well S8. So what this shows is we've got good correlation of water levels across the river valley. Now, the red dot is where the trigger is set. Now, down below, you'll see a black line that connects to the N well, and it says minimum threshold 1062. With reviewing this, what we see is that the minimum threshold is 1062, but the trigger is quite a bit more than 2 feet above that. And so we're looking at refining that and moving that red dot down closer to what the GSP says it should be. And we'll keep your board up to date on these. But we just wanted to show this so you sort of knew the direction we were going and what we were seeing in the field. This wouldn't have been possible several months ago because we didn't have this information, which we have now. So we're able to do this kind of work. Okay, moving on. Next slide, please. We talked last time about the baseline GDE monitoring. Since then, well, the baseline GDE monitoring had been completed. Since then, we did a preliminary GDE evaluation. We knew we were getting close to the trigger. We were still several feet away from the trigger at GDEA. We also realized that, you know what, that trigger is probably not correct. given that it was so much higher than the historic low. But we went ahead and we decided to do the initial GDE evaluation anyway. We can, that report isn't complete yet. We can present it to your board next round, but the bottom line is, given the habitat condition in the river, the biologists didn't think that management actions were recommended. That was not a surprise to us, given what we now see with the trigger being a little bit off track. So that's something we can bring back to your board at our next meeting. Next slide, please. We continue to coordinate with 5 Point. The groundwater levels are above the minimum thresholds. And we continue to actively encourage water conservation. And this is a little bit of a left turn, Director Cooper, but I heard you talking about precipitation. I talked with Sarah Fleury this morning. We've had 10 inches or almost 12 inches of precipitation since the beginning of October, our water year. So we expect. Yes, yeah, but happening over last year, we had most of it in 1 month. So, okay, next slide, please. Fiscal and grants. So your board authorized SCV Water to apply for this grant application for $5.3 million. That application's been submitted. It will take the Department of Water Resources quite a few months to render a decision on it. That's just their calendar, so we'll keep you posted on that. Our authorized reimbursement to date is approximately 1.08 million from the previous 2 grants that we've received. And that rate of reimbursement has slowed down quite a bit, as expected, as we're wrapping certain work up. Next slide, please. So our look ahead, we're going to continue to be hitting these technical issues hard. We've talked about some of those. We're still working on the monitoring and reporting. The annual report is under preparation as we speak. We talked a little bit about the GDE data collection. We'll be wrapping up our evaluation and we can present that to you next round. We continue to work on the flow model. There's good work taking place with the flow model. It's really good to have better information to plug into that model, and that's bearing fruit for us. Outreach, we will continue to work on this. I think by next quarter when we meet, we'll be talking to your board more about policy with metering and monitoring. And we continue to work towards the data sharing agreement with 5 Point. In April, I think that wraps up. Can I have the next slide? Yep, conclusions. So board, more of the same here. We just continue to chip away, fill data gaps. We're thrilled to have the contract for the data management system initiated. We continue to coordinate with downstream. Looking forward, we'll continue to bring updates to your board. We will be talking to your board about policy level discussions regarding metering, well registration at the appropriate time. We continue to track well permitting. You notice the staff report describes there really hasn't been any activity since we last talked to your board about this. But we are in communication with LA County's team that does the well permitting. And we are just continuing to work and fill data gaps and coordinate with others. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. April, do we have any public comment on this presentation?
We do not.
Okay. Any director comments or questions? Director Natoli.
Thank you, President Goodside. I do have a few questions, Mr. Veergoots. In the section for the valuation of non-de minimis well locations, there's a portion that says the stakeholder engagement consultant will begin outreach after board discussion. As far as that outreach goes, do we know yet what this would look like and how it would be done?
Let me take a step back and answer it. So Director Natoli, our next step is to finalize our review of the well database and identify exactly which well operators we want to conduct the outreach to. So that step is sort of the next big component. Once that is done, we will either send out a mailer. This is a really good question because I'm thinking of the timing. It might be that we come back to your board and have a discussion at a high level about policy before we start doing that outreach. So that would be next quarter.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Evaluating areas for land subsidence, monitoring. The middle paragraphs ends with the phrase areas where in a draft subsidence evaluation area based on areas where future groundwater elevations are anticipated to be lower than in the past. So how will those areas where the future groundwater elevations are anticipated to be lower, how will those areas be identified? Because you're projecting. So how will we identify those potential lower areas?
That's a great question. And the answer is that we have programmed into the basin operating plan, a plan to extract more groundwater from certain wells in the future to help manage the basin, in particular, the perchlorate issue, such as pumping more from V201. So the groundwater sustainability plan looks at that ramp up in certain wells, and that's how we know where the areas would be where groundwater elevations will be lower. Boy, that's terrible English. But we know where the increased pumping is going to take place.
So does that mean it would be based strictly on increased pumping?
Yes. Mhm.
And then I just have one other one. Under the county well permitting, there was a discussion that perhaps a couple of people had come in questioning about questioning getting well permits.
Right.
And it seems like, well, it says, since it appears there is no well permitting activity, we will continue to research specifics to assist with determining the best path for policy development, which seems like we're waiting for someone to come in and actually ask for a permit before we decide what we want to do. And it seems to me we would probably be better served, and the public would probably be better served if we worked that out ahead of time. So we're not delaying the amount of time it takes to establish those procedures when someone comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest we continue to work on it, whether or not someone has come in and asked, because at some point, someone will come in and ask or need to come in and ask. And it sure would be nice if we already had that process set up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President.
It's a great comment. Any other comments from directors or questions? Director Martin.
Thank you, President Goodsite. Rick, real quick, I don't want to belabor the GDE issue, but in your written report on page 7, we refer to areas that are demonstrating some signs of drought stress, from none to minor to some moderate. And yet, so I'm curious, how does drought stress work together with trigger levels of groundwater? Because your conclusion is that no action needs to be taken. You're just going to kind of watch it, I guess, continue to monitor it. So
That is correct. At our last meeting, we talked about a
evaluation that had been done, a data gathering exercise that had been done by our biologic consultant that looked at 3 areas upstream from Interstate 5. And yes, they identified that in some areas at the edge of these areas with vegetation, there was some signs of drought stress at the edges of some of these areas. In other cases, they found minor or no drought stress. So from a big picture perspective, these are large areas, many acres. Signs of drought stress along the edge was not a cause of concern in itself. That would be expected. The work was done in the heat of the summer. So you could say that the drought stress was, I don't want to say expected, but not remarkable. Now, your question about triggers and how it ties in, over time, as we develop more historic data about the groundwater elevations in these areas, we hope to be able to develop a correlation between groundwater elevation and drought stress, perhaps. But we're a ways away from that.
Okay, thank you. And I guess to me, the obvious thing would be is once the drought eases, which it may be doing right now as we speak, you would expect these stressed areas to be relieved to some extent at least.
Absolutely.
Or is it a 12-month cycle? You mentioned summer. I mean, summer here is pretty hot. I mean, we see those stressed areas even during a non-drought period during the summer months when there's no rain.
I didn't understand that last part.
Okay. So if there's declared to be out of the drought, wouldn't
Yes.
expect to see these stressed areas. Is that right?
When we're out of the drought,
Well,
would
okay,
we see
it's your
the
word. You
stressed
referred
areas?
to it as drought stress. So
Right.
I'm saying
Right.
that's kind of a underlying condition for these stressed areas that are showing signs of stress because of the drought.
Right. You could say it's an expected condition that
Okay.
they would show stress during that time frame.
Okay, so so it stands to reason that once we're out of the drought, which may be coming close,
Right.
those indications would probably ease up somewhat.
Absolutely.
All right.
And
Okay.
yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Thanks, Rick. That's it.
Couple, actually, Director Martin's question spurred something. Because I remember this discussion when we were adopting the triggers and other parameters. We talked about, what is this agency responsible for? We're responsible for monitoring the water levels and making sure they're at a level we think is going to maintain the GDEs. But do we need to do anything if there's drought stress? Is that just a piece of information, or are we also monitoring for drought stress? Or did we just do that as part of the GDE project?
I think if there's drought stress, and it will recover when the drought ends. The groundwater sustainability plan identified that, yes, there could be times when the vegetation is stressed. But over the long term, we see that it's been very resilient, including through drought.
Mhm.
And so drought stress by itself doesn't cause the GSA to need to take any specific action.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. That was my recollection. And then just on two things. I also agree with a lot of the comments from Director Natoli about getting ahead of, what we would do if there's a well permit asked for, and also early lead time on, what are we going to tell these large pumpers? What are we going to ask of the large pumpers? What do we expect with that? I saw you're doing some research on what other areas have done, but I don't want to try to have that be too tight and get everybody all upset. And then lastly, you talk about evaluation of use of domestic wells for groundwater monitoring. Two questions. You have 1,200 well completion reports, but then you drilled down to domestic or irrigation wells. What are the other ones and why aren't we considering talking to those people?
The other ones are things like environmental evaluation wells. They may be cathodic protection wells. They may be engineering test holes.
Mm,
They're just not the typical well that's making water that we want to
Okay.
be keeping an eye on.
and they're maybe not monitored on a regular basis, that kind of thing, or less reliable data, it sounds like you're saying?
Well, some of them, the cathodic protection wells and the engineering test borings, those really aren't wells. They are records in the database because the state requires those be permitted.
Mm,
So those aren't wells in the traditional sense that we're looking at them.
okay.
And then the environmental permitting wells, those are typically smaller diameter, shorter lived. We're not really focusing on those.
Okay,
Mhm.
that was it. All right. Seeing no further questions on this. Thank you, Mr. Vergoot. And we'll move on to item 4, informational purposes only, Aqua General Session Membership Meeting from November 30th. Director Martin has a presentation.
Thank you, President Gutsai. So my report is as follows. As a voting delegate for the SCV GSA, I attended the general session meeting. I'm out. My hearing aids are talking to me.
Just side conversation.
It thinks I asked the question.
I have that problem and I don't have
Hey, right,
hearing
right,
aids.
All right. No. All right. Behave yourself. All right, I love high-tech stuff, you know. So I go back, I did attend the general session membership meeting on November 30, 2022 in Indian Wells. 2 items that were on the agenda, and I voted for the approval of both items. The first was approval of the minutes from the December 1st, 2021 general session meeting, and the second item, a little more substantial, was the approval of the proposed amendments, amended and restated bylaws. And far better than the notes that I took is the article that was in the December 16th Aqua News that described the changes that were made to the bylaws. The amendments were originally recommended by the Board of Directors. As approved, they will also revise Aqua's election process for board officers. They include clarifying language to reflect consistency with other governance documents and daily operations, implementing changes to the board officers election process as recommended by the election task force, incorporating California Corporations Code provisions, allowing meetings to be held by electronic communication, restructuring and reformatting to incorporate a new numbering system. And secondly, a list of amendments to the Aqua bylaws affecting the association's election process for board officers include moving from in-person only voting to allow members to vote remotely by email or US mail, hosting a town hall webinar featuring candidates for board president and vice president, creating an elections page on Aqua's website to share relevant information with members, creating an elections committee representing all 10 regions of Aqua, along with a representative appointed by the president to review nominee qualifications and identify a recommended candidate for the ballot, listing all qualified candidates for office on the ballot, and eliminating the nomination of candidates from the floor of the membership meeting. There will be more details of these changes during the coming year. That is my report. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a clarifying question for those that are here that are not familiar with Aqua. Aqua is Association of California Water Agencies, and do the GSAs automatically get to participate, or do we buy into membership in Aqua as a GSA? How does that work?
We are a member of Aqua, correct, Mr. Cole?
Yeah,
We bought it.
I can
Okay,
answer that
thank
if
you.
you'd like, President Goodside. Yeah, so the GSAs need insurance.
Okay,
And to acquire insurance, Aqua JPIA is a good way to go about that. They've structured an insurance program to support GSAs in the state. So to have access through that door, you need to be a member of Aqua.
Okay.
So the GSA itself is a member of Aqua, and we acquire our insurance through Aqua JPIA,
okay,
Joint Powers Insurance Authority.
okay. Thank you. And I will say, Aqua has tremendous resources and does a lot of legislative work. So, hopefully if the GSA needs anything or wants to focus on anything that would be helpful to the GSA, we can do so through Aqua because of our membership. So that's good.
For example, Aqua got heavily involved in extending this well permitting executive order and putting it into legislation, and ended up defeating the bill based on concerns expressed by its GSA members and others.
So can you clarify that?
Yeah.
What bill?
There was an assembly bill, I don't remember the number, that required well applicants to get a statement from the GSA that it wouldn't affect the sustainability of the basin, and it was consistent with the GSP and so forth. Similar to what the executive order says. But Aqua, as I say, got involved in that and was unable to come to something that everybody agreed to, and ultimately that bill was defeated. So we have the executive order as long as that lasts, but that's the only
Okay.
part of it.
Okay, and that was because the GSAs that were active in Aqua didn't like it the way it was.
Well, that's my understanding. I'm not sure if they were the only people who commented,
Mhm. Yeah,
but yes, they had problems with it.
okay, thank you. All right. Thank you, Director Martin. Did we need any public comment on this? I forgot to do that.
There is no public comment.
All right, thank you. Moving on to item 5, special procedures. This is appointment of board president and vice president for the 2023 term. We have an approved rotational schedule with Russ Bryden being appointed board president and Gary Martin as vice president for the 2023 term. First, we will see if there's any public comment on that.
And there is not.
All right, and then I will ask both members if they are interested in taking those seats or want to not do it for some reason. Yeah, it says right on here, I'm supposed to ask. I'm supposed to ask.
Don't give them.
Happy to serve.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Do we need a vote on this, April?
Oh.
No?
Don't believe so, no.
We did this
Oh.
last year.
Okay. All right, congratulations. Thank you. All right, are there any director requests for future agenda items? Any public comments?
There is not.
All right, we will adjourn. Thank you so much. Yep. Appreciate you guys coming up in the rainy weather. I was worried about you. I was waiting for the